So the US election is over and the results are in for definite. Trump won by a landslide. This is pretty old news now, of course, it's about 2 days old. But I think they're still probably counting the votes and getting them all in. But the mainstream media totally missed the mark on this and were either unwilling or unable to objectively report on this. Now, this isn't the end for mainstream outlets, but I reckon it's another clear sign of their obvious decline. Meanwhile, alternative voices and platforms like Joe Rogan are rising. He had Trump on his podcast, of course, while Kamala Harris stuck with the traditional media. And as the media landscape shifts, I think it's pretty clear that people are rejecting elite narratives and embracing independent voices. And of course, that's been our stick here at Factel Investment Research and Factel Daily for the past 20 years. For many years, we felt like a lone voice, and I think we played our own sort of little humble part in sharing a few insights that you would not have heard from the mainstream media. And that was Jim Rickards. I mean, he actually called on Monday the election results with remarkable foresight and clarity. Now, in Factel Daily today is written by our editorial director, Greg Canavan. Usually it is Nick Hubble, who joins me today from Spain. He is actually on a family holiday, so Greg took his part. But you should go and check out that article. It's 100% free, of course, and the link will be there below. But I wanted to get Nick on to get his thoughts because you work very closely with Jim, and he pretty much nailed this result, didn't he? In all quarters.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't a surprise in any way to the subscribers of Jim's work. Also, wasn't a surprise, as you suggested, to the people who were willing to look a bit closer at what was really going on inside those polls, what was the typical miss that those polls tend to give. So it all it went down almost exactly as Jim Rickards and a lot of the other skeptics of the mainstream media and the polling industry suggested it would. The most remarkable of all was Dominic Cummings in the UK, so a former political operative inside the UK government and a master at winning things like the Brexit referendum and some elections. He called it right down to this precise number of electoral college votes. So he knew which swing states would go, which was in the end all of them. Like you said, 2 are still counting, but Trump's expected to win those. So it was sort of predictable how the left-wing biased media would fail, which is what makes this especially interesting. You had 2 very different narratives. You had the left-wing narrative that Kamala Harris would win, the right one that Trump would win. That's sort of fairly normal, but the right wing just got it so cleanly correct that things are a bit suspicious and a bit odd. There's a lot of attention being drawn at the moment to the fact that the number of votes that Democrats got in the popular vote has been sort of steadily, very slowly increasing over the years because of population growth, except for that one outlier in 2020, which is making very many people suspicious about what happened that year. And I think a lot of people are asking now, why did the voter turnout rise in this election, and yet the Democrats' share of the vote, the Democrat number of votes fell dramatically.
Do you think, that there was a little in-house thread actually on that very topic, and Greg actually pointed out, it looks like the anomaly was 2020, and this result has kind of gone back to the norm in that respect. Do you think COVID had some kind of part in that, though, as in some way?
Well, I don't know about COVID, but there would have been the anger about Trump or whatever it might be. But it really is a very unusual looking blip on any sort of chart. Who knows what's behind it? But the point is that if this is a shift back to normality, then that has really big implications for the Democrats, right? Because it implies that their win in 2020 was something unusual that they can't continue to rely on, because it was a large margin of victory for Trump this time around.
Yeah. You should head over to our Factel Daily article and get Greg's take on it. He sums it up pretty nicely. and it kind of really showcases what we try and do on a daily basis at Fat Daily as well. The market was clearly not ready for the Trump victory, right, Nick? I mean, a few little things that happened. US indices soared, Aussie stocks fell, bond yields rose across the board. That signals growth prospects and also inflation concerns. Gold, silver, and copper got completely dumped, and profit taking and concerns about a less green administration were the reasons, or perhaps behind these moves. US coal stocks also surged quite hard, while Aussie coal stocks pretty much stayed flat. Energy stocks rallied, even though Trump is meant to be bearish for oil in terms of the oil price. He wants to flood the market. What have you got? Just let's get a few of your thoughts on the market moves in the aftermath, and where do we go from here, and then we can move on to another thing that I want to talk to you about today.
Yeah, it was a very odd mix, a very odd combination to try and figure out what the threat is here. It's odd that financial markets were so surprised by this. My suggestion to you would be that it was the Republicans' victory in the House and the Senate that moved the markets so much because, like every president, Trump does rely on whether he can get his legislation through the Congress, and it looks like he will be able to based on the results in the House and the Senate. I don't think the presidential election was a big surprise for financial markets. So I suspect what happens now is the key will become the relationship between Trump and the rest of the Republican Party, which has its ups and downs. They might not want to go along with some of what he has in mind, especially it's the second term, even though it was interrupted. So my worry is the bond market. It's the fact that the Federal Reserve's cutting rates and the bond market's plunging, so yields are going up. That divergence is very dangerous. We saw in the UK how a surging bond market can cause trouble. We're seeing in the Australian media today how bond market yield surges can cause trouble for borrowers. We're seeing now in the US where yields have gone up a heck of a lot already, and then they jumped again on Trump's victory, presumably because he's going to spend so much or have such big deficits, at least anyway. I think that international story, which Trump is only one example, the Germans are next now and the French, that is the bigger story, is whether the bond market can finance the populist wave or the right-wing wave. And we know from what happened to Liz Truss in the UK that it can go very wrong.
Can you just for any viewers that aren't too familiar, or because we say these terms, bond yields are rising. Can you just explain in layman's terms why that's really significant?
Yeah, so when the government borrows money, it has to pay interest, just like on mortgage. The bond yield is the interest rate that the government has to pay to borrow money. So shortly after the election results, the yield on American government debt rose. So if the government were to try and borrow money now in America, it would become more expensive to do so. This also has an impact on the value of the old loans that were previously given. So those fell, which is bad news for the people that own them. It's like a fixed rate mortgage. But the yield can change, but it's the price that moves rather than the interest. So the point being that borrowing costs have gone up despite the fact that central banks are cutting interest rates, which is a very odd and unusual divergence. And in different countries, this plays out differently because in some countries, your mortgage is tied to the central bank interest rate. And in some countries, your mortgage is tied to the government's interest rate, the government's borrowing, which is called the yield. So there's some odd goings on in the bond market, which to me suggests that we could be on the cusp of the Liz Truss moment, the famous moment when the UK government almost went bust because the bond market crashed. For example, yields on UK government debt are now actually higher than they were under Liz Truss when she had to resign. So
Right.
I think there's this threat of this Liz Truss moment is spreading to countries that include the UK and the US and perhaps a few others in Europe as well now.
Cool. Yeah. So let's move on to what I wanted to ask you about today. So it kind of relates to all this, and it kind of brings it back to Australia a bit more. So last week, was it last week? We got on camera, and 2 weeks ago. It was 2 weeks ago. We did a video, and the title, the thumbnail was, "Who is Australia's Javier Milei?" Did I pronounce his name right? You tell me.
Javier, you got to roll the J.
Roll the J, right. Who is Australia's Milei, basically? Now, he's the libertarian, I would say quite hard libertarian president, prime minister. What is it? It's president?
He's president, yeah, and
Who's
he's an
what's the title?
anarcho-capitalist, so he's as
Yeah.
extreme as the libertarians get.
Yeah, and he's in charge of Argentina. And as we know, for the last 70 years, Argentina has been a basket case economy. We've got former colleagues in sorry, not former ones, colleagues in Argentina. I've got former colleagues there too, and they were telling me when they're trying to run a business there, they've always used to have to adjust their prices on a monthly basis just because of inflation was so high. Anyway, we asked the question. You asked the question: who is Australia's version of this? Now, this video, while it hasn't got the most views, it's done pretty well. The comments on there, it really did strike a nerve. So I thought what we might be fun to do is go back to that idea. Now, if viewers want to go and watch that, we'll also provide a link to that original video from 2 weeks ago. Take a watch. It's really fascinating discussion. But I thought I'd just raise a few of the comments and readers, and you can then answer them, Nick. So the first one, I thought that'd be quite useful for viewers that come back. The first comment, and I won't say who wrote them, just out of privacy things, but the guy is too optimistic. So the guy being you is too optimistic about the Australian economy. We don't really produce anything other than mass immigration. There are no good jobs. Many companies stopped hiring and some laying off masses. We have 18 months of the worst recession per capita in Australian history. But hey, the landlords are doing just fine, politicians included. What are your thoughts on that comment?
Yeah, I agree with it all. The question, though, is relative, right? So compared to what? So I can tell you as a fact that Australia is doing quite well compared to the sorts of countries that you might want to compare it to, especially those in Europe. And my point in the video was that because our debt to GDP ratio is so much lower, even if we do face all of these same problems as the Europeans do, which is what that comment is all about, that gives us time to fix things before we get into a complete mess like Argentina does. So the hope is that Javier Milei becomes the shining example of what governments should be doing. And perhaps Elon Musk and Donald Trump will, but I doubt it, but perhaps they'll come up with something decent as well. And Australia has the time to change. Whereas for Europe, basically, it's too late, right? Europe's going to go down an Argentina path now. I don't think anyone can save it. There's too much debt.
Yeah.
And so as bad as things might be in Australia, and one of the other commenters for the video pointed out that the only thing we really have is resources, which is a really important point. But the debt to GDP ratio buys us enough time to prevent the very worst of what's going to happen in places like Europe.
Okay, on that, there's a comment on there that basically addresses that very thing that you say there's time for Australian politicians to do something about it. This is the comment. Tell him he's dreaming. Australian politicians will see the problem on the horizon and make the necessary changes. Sorry, it was a question, Nick. Sorry. Tell him he's dreaming. Australian politicians will see the problem on the horizon and make the necessary painful changes before the disaster strikes. That has never happened, and the current crop are just too spineless, too petty, too ideologically driven, just focused on point scoring. The responsible ones, on the other hand, have their heads up their own, insert expletive, promoting nuclear power, and have spent the last week having a go at the Prime Minister about flight upgrades and access to the Qantas Executive Lounge. So I knew that one would make you giggle, but what do you say to that? So you might very well say that there's plenty of time to fix it, but will we?
Yeah.
Do
This is why
politicians ever do that?
That's right. We spent ages discussing what the name of this video should be because it's not really about who will be Australia's Javier Milei. Right? We don't really discuss the potential politicians out there because, as this comment and this question says, there isn't anyone, and the sorts of people you might be hopeful for are disappointing often. And I don't think there's anyone quite as radical and as completely different as Javier Milei, who really grabs the issues as you would want them to be grabbed, rather than spending time on flights and whatever else, all this other nonsense. But my point is that Javier Milei popped out of seemingly nowhere. And those colleagues you mentioned in Argentina, actually, they were involved in his sudden transition into politics personally, and they made the connections that made that possible. So they know a bit about that story. These Javier Milei types, they can pop out of pretty much anywhere. They are around. They're just not involved in politics precisely for the reasons that comment raises. They don't want to spend their time arguing with the prime minister about things like travel, but free travel. I think the nuclear power part is uncalled for. I think that's a good thing to pursue. But we need the public to wake up first, right? That's the point of Argentina. We had this long period of inflationary nightmare hell doing what politicians want to do. And they actually had to go through that before they were willing to elect someone like Javier Milei. And my point is, Australia might not actually have to go through that because of this lower debt GDP ratio. And we have time to find this Javier Milei type. Or our own politicians might wake up and decide that we don't necessarily need to follow the sorts of policies that Javier Milei is putting in place in Argentina because we're not in as much of a hole in terms of the government debt, at least. So our mainstream politicians might wake up. The biggest obstacle to this is the one that always pops up in the UK. So for those of you who don't know, I work with Nigel Farage at the Fleet Street Letter and Fortune and Freedom, which is our sister company in the UK. And I get lots and lots of emails in the inbox saying, Nigel for PM, Nigel for Prime Minister. And the whole point in the Westminster system, which Australia has too, is that you can't just elect a president. You can't just elect your Prime Minister. It's a party political system. So you need a whole party apparatus in order to change things. In the US, you can elect Trump. In Argentina, you can elect Milei. In Australia and the UK, you can't do that sort of thing. And most of Europe, you can't either, France being the exception. So it's more difficult to have that sort of political revolution in a Westminster system. So it's less likely. Otherwise, Nigel Farage would have been more powerful a long time ago. So maybe Australia won't see that type of shift. But my key point here is that even the political class might wake up if the electorate wakes up first in Australia. And there's nothing like really bad examples of what can go wrong coming out of places like Europe and the US to make people wake up. And if they do, we have that time because of our debt, low levels of debt compared to everyone else, to get change done.
On that, there's a comment. Nick is very well spoken and thoughtful, so lots of praise for your views. Unfortunately, he is completely delusional about Australia being in a decent position. What do you say to that, Nick?
Yeah, well, we are just comparatively speaking.
Yes,
it's the same as the first question, right? I completely agree with all the criticism in those comments, not just that one, about how bad things are in Australia in so many different ways. It's just they're so much worse in parts of Europe and parts in the US, obviously in Argentina. So you have to realize that as frustrating as Australia can be in so many different ways, it's still extraordinarily good in many ways. And still holds an extraordinary advantage in many ways. There was some newspaper stories recently about companies and civil servants in Europe. They largely use fax machines still. In Japan, you have to go to the local council to register every time you show up. Otherwise, you don't have health insurance. There's no way to do anything online or by mail. You have to physically show up. There's all these bizarre things going on around the world in public civil service jobs that Australians would be like, just wouldn't believe. The levels of corruption, the levels of the connections between the banking system and the political system. That sort of thing is just the norm elsewhere. And in Australia, as bad as you might think things are, it's not as bad as it is in Europe and the US.
Another comment, Australia, somebody who agrees with you, by the way, Australia is in just as bad a position as the other Western nations. The only thing staving off collapse is the fact that we actually have a mining industry. Your thoughts on that?
And this is the key, and that's one of the reasons why the debt-GDP ratio is so low, right? And we're heavily criticized for the fact that we don't have the high value-added industries, which basically means manufacturing. Our services industry is pretty good as well, but it's the mining that raises the heavy tax revenue, right? The thing is, there's plenty of resources in Europe. There's plenty of resources all over the place in the world. It's just Australia seems to have the government context that allows the mining and resources boom to take place. Perhaps it's just a population density issue. That's changing right now, right? There's a lot of super profit tax, resource tax in Queensland, all these sorts of things. So this is the sorts of place where marginal change might happen, where people should pay attention to, because we need to keep that goose laying that golden egg. And if we don't, or if our financial system in Australia has some sort of meltdown that requires the government to bail it out, then we start to look more like Ireland and places like that, where they got into trouble all of a sudden in terms of their debt to GDP ratio because of the size of their financial system. And then if we lose the resources industry in some way by overtaxing it or over-regulating all of the green regulations, then we could very quickly, very suddenly be in trouble. It's also quite noticeable, though, that like the US, we could revive our energy and mining and resources industries very quickly, even if we do kill that goose, right? Because the resources will still be there. Europe, I don't think, has much chance of reviving large-scale mining or energy anymore, even if they do have a massive political change, as, for example, Germany is likely to in the next few weeks.
Just to finish off, there's just a couple of questions. Well, I'll meld them into one because they kind of relate to our currency, the Australian dollar. So there's one in agreement. The Australian economy is not heading in a good direction, but we are a long way from the Argentinian situation, whereas they, as a nation, they lost their ability to issue debt in their own currency. And another interesting about the possibility that you said of the Australian dollar soaring. It might be interesting to explore how that might affect investments. Australia is unique in that we have a relatively low national debt, but yet we have some of the highest personal corporate debt in the world.
Yeah, that last point on the corporate debt is whether there's going to be some sort of bailout from the government when there's a debt crisis in Australia, which never seems to happen, but we can't be immune ultimately. The rising Australian dollar is the key issue here, and it's actually the key issue for me personally in my financial life as well. So if I'm right and Australia has this advantage, this lucky country moment coming, where the rest of the world gets into a debt crisis and inflation crisis and gets into all sorts of trouble over the next few decades, whereas Australia does not, because we have bought ourselves time by keeping the debt low, and Australia has at least the opportunity to avoid what the places like Europe and the US will go through. That implies the Australian dollar is going to skyrocket because Australia will basically become like a safe haven. So when funds want to invest their money, if European government bonds are too dangerous, if American government bonds are too dangerous, there's very few other options left, and Australia would be one of the very few. So Australia could become a place that is safe for capital because of that low level of debt. In which case, the Australian dollar would go up enormously, and that's hugely important for investors, which is what we discussed previously. If the Australian dollar goes up and you invest overseas, that negates any sort of gains that you might make in overseas markets. If you invest in the Australian market and the Australian dollar soars over a long period of time, that divides the Australian stock market into two parts. One part that benefits from a rising dollar, one part that struggles. So, for example, our resources stocks would suffer under a soaring Australian dollar because it would cut into their profits. They sell goods in US dollars, and that would be devalued as the Australian dollar rises. There are parts of the Australian market that benefit from a stronger Australian dollar. There's lots of different ways to play a stronger Australian dollar. But the point is that if you agree with me that Australia has a better chance than anyone else out there of avoiding these debt crises, you would probably conclude the Australian dollar is going to go up a lot. So you would need to shift your investment mix in your portfolio to adjust for that, to take into account this huge revaluation of foreign investments and investments within the Aussie market. And also you need to think about, for example, I'll be dividing my time over the next decade or so between living in Japan and Australia. One of the reasons is I'll be earning Australian dollars, and if the Australian dollar goes up a lot and I'm in Japan, my cost of living crashes, which is great, right? So there are lots of impacts that are going to play out over the next few years because of the Australian dollar for just about everyone in Australia, if we're right about how these things are going to change.
Fascinating stuff. We'll leave it there, Nick, 'cause it's been about half an hour, and I appreciate your on your holiday, so I'll let you get back to it. Thanks so much for jumping on. I thought fascinating discussion. It was a fascinating video last time. So for you watching, there's a few links to go to. There's today's Fat Tail Daily piece from Greg Canavan, our investment director, head of research. And that's a really good piece too. Go and check that out. And also go and check out the last video that Nick and I did. Well, it wasn't the last one, it was 2 weeks ago. Go and check that out too and see what this discussion was all based on. And please keep commenting and liking and pushing that notification button to get notified when a new video is published. Thanks so much, Nick. Thank you, buddy. Oh, he's muted, but he said see you later. We'll catch you in a bit. Thanks for tuning in to Fat Tail Daily. If you're ready to take a new approach to building wealth, avoiding the same old mainstream ideas and investigating new market trends, then make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you don't miss a single video. And as a thank you, we've got a free report just for you. It is packed with actionable insights that show you how to capitalize on an alternative investment idea that you'll unlikely find anywhere else. You can download it right now by clicking on the link in the description below. So, if you're ready to discover strategies that the traditional market just doesn't offer, grab your free report and start exploring what the parallel economy can do for you. Until next time.